Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Toshiko Mori, professor in the practice of architecture here at the GSD. First of all, some of the practical matters with regards to upcoming events in the GSD Fall Public Lecture Series. On Monday, September 21st, Kylie Fellow Seth Denizen will share his research on the use of wastewater in Mexico. And on Tuesday, September 22nd, Alex Krieger will speak about shifting American ideals and instincts, drawing on his research from his 2019 book, City on a Hill. Now, hola. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's conversation between Professor Rafael Moneo and Dean Sert Whiting. This event is the inaugural lecture for the John Q. Hejduk Soundings Lectureship. This lectureship celebrates the life and work of John Hejduk, MArch 53, and evokes his spirit and ethos as a tremendously influential figure of architectural practice and pedagogy. It also coincides this year with 20th anniversary of his passing. His daughter Renata Hejduk, who is a professor at Arizona State University and holds a PhD in architectural history and theory from Harvard, says, quote, "I feel that the ethos of the lecture series is particularly present today and reminds us that the most essential thing for my father was a social contract and a commitment to open and critical dialogue," end of quote. I was fortunate enough to be his student at Cooper Union, and then later a colleague as a teacher there. He continued to be a mentor to me as well as to so many others of many generations of architects all over the world. He told us that, a quote, "Teaching is the birthright of architects. Do not give it up," end of quote. And because of that, many of us actually remained as teachers as well as architects. And so did Rafael, who is going to be talking to you today. By this, he meant that it is our obligation as architects to honor the social contract by returning our knowledge of our profession to the next generations of architects and the public. From 1975 to 2000, John Hejduk served as a Dean of School of Architecture at Cooper Union, where he transformed critical discourse and architectural practice in profound and fundamental ways. He was a poet, artist, writer, architect, builder who did not separate elements of his practice by the mode of expression of medium, but allowed these various disciplines to converge, believing that the architecture is a broader and all-encompassing state of mind. He shared his melancholy in his work also. Many of his projects evoke the sorrows of victims of brutality, almost as if trying to warn and prepare us for the uncertain times we now face today, but provided us with his architecture optimistic courage to forge ahead into a better future. His rigor and precision were balanced against poetic spiritual evocations. This balance created a critical and active discourse between imagination, observations, and tectonic in his architecture. His body of work includes housing projects in Berlin, the Wall House in Groningen, and Tower in Santiago de Compostela, as well as renovation and foundation building at Cooper Union and many, many different publications. He was a large human being. He was literally about 7 feet tall, but with a gentle soul, strict and definitive, yet understanding of the fragility of humanity. Rafael Moneo was invited to teach at Cooper Union in the late 70s and quickly became a vital part of John Hejduk's pedagogical team, along with Peter Eisenman, Raymond Abraham, and around the same time, Frank Gehry was teaching thesis at Cooper Union. Rafael had a very special place in John Hejduk's thoughts and heart. and his family shares the same sentiment. John and Rafael enjoyed a long friendship and mutual respect for each other for many, many years. So I cannot imagine anyone better than Rafael to help celebrate the inauguration of this lectureship. Rafael Moneo, who served as the chair of the Department of Architecture at the GSD, is the Emeritus Jose Luis Sert Professor in Architecture, is a winner of numerous prizes, including Pritzker Prize, Premium Imperiale, Royal Gold Medal or RIBA, and National Spanish Architecture Prize. He has published numerous monographs, including remarkable 21 works. In his book, Theoretical Anxiety and Design Strategy in the Work of 8 Contemporary Architects, demonstrates his remarkable career as a critic and theoretician in parallel with his formidable portfolio of architectural projects. He is joining us from his home city of Madrid, and then the format of today is a conversation with our formidable, indefatigable, and courageous Dean, Sarah Whiting. The chat function has been disabled so that we can all focus on this very important conversation, and Sarah and Rafa will respond to questions after the conversation. The audience is welcome to send questions to them at any time during the conversation by clicking Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom. We also have a live captioner providing captions during this event. You can enable captions by clicking the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. Please welcome Rafael Moneo and Dean Sarah Whiting.
Excellent. Thank you, Toshiko. That was a fantastic introduction and memory of John Hejduk. You really set up this lecture in a terrific context. I really appreciate it. And I'm quite honored to be here today to work with Rafael for this lecture. So Rafael, you should unmute yourself and turn on your video. And so, as Toshiko explained, we're going to have a conversation today. It would be much better in person, over a glass of Rafael's fantastic wine, sitting and sharing a conversation with all of you. But I'm very grateful that Zoom permits us to have this conversation in the intimate company of what looks like almost 1,000 people. So it's quite striking that this format at least opens this up to an enormous number of people. So I want to welcome Rafael here this afternoon. And so I gave Rafael a heads up that I was going to send him or give him essentially 5 questions to structure this around, and we will talk as old friends. And I have to say I'm honored to be the next Jose Luis Sert professor. So I inherited this professorship from Rafael. So I feel quite honored to be here speaking with you today. And as you might note, I'm speaking in front of the Laboratory for Integrated Science and Engineering, which is Rafael's building on our campus virtually. It's behind me. So I wanted to start our conversation this afternoon, Rafael, by turning to Hejduk himself, given that this is a lecture in his honor. And I wanted you to tell us a little bit more, maybe elaborate a little bit more on Toshiko's introduction, where you can tell us about your own relationship to John Hejduk. You came as chair here at the JSD in 1985. Hejduk had been dean already for 10 years at Cooper and had a very evident pedagogical hand there, where the famous 9-square grid problem and other exercises at Cooper. And I wondered, as you landed here at the GSD in the position of chair, how your relationship to Hejduk and to Cooper influenced your definition of the pedagogy here at the GSD in 1985.
Well, let me start telling you both, Toshiko and Sarah, how grateful I am because you have wanted to join me in this conversation and in this first lecture honoring John Hejduk. And after saying that, I won't remember John as an extremely generous and open figure. I think that the mythical condition that still his name has had behind an actual reality that justify this legend condition that his name evokes today. When I arrived to New York in September of 1976, I had a commitment with Peter Eisenman to be at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies that was an extremely active center as much as it was very short in resources. Peter asked John to hire me in Cooper because it was a very well-established institution. He accepted me without any hesitation, without knowing me, and just with an extreme act of generosity and faith in his friend's recommendation. I think that I met John in the Cooper Union, and the memories I have of him is just thinking in the building, the institution, and his figure, even his physical figure as a whole. The entire Cooper Union was impregnated of him. He was entirely the institution, and it's difficult for me to think in Cooper Union just thinking that John isn't there. I catch up immediately the depth of his teaching, and I was introduced in something that very vaguely knew, that was the 9 square grid. I think that the 9 square grid deserves a certain reflection about it, and it forces us to remember what in John Hejduk, let's say, friendship better than education or better than just formation, meant that the years he spent in Austin, in Texas, when he met together with Colin Rowe and Bob Slasky. And just thinking in both of them that surely are behind the 9 square grid, you should think about Rudolf Whitcover, that publishing the Architecture in the Age of Humanists in 1949, indeed taught one thing, taught so many students, so many architects, that something was behind that architecture that deserved to be observed. And then surely the inspiration for the 9 square grid exercise came for those schemes of Whitcover that had been, let's say, that has been caught immediately by this very acute eye that Colin Rowe had. The result, I'm just mixing both Colin teaching and Bob Slasky profound knowledge of the cubism came out the 9 square grid exercise that, as John Hejduk said, should be seen as a pedagogical tool. A tool that suddenly giving students this frame or this structure and asking them to do something that had architectural intention, even more than meaning. Put on the table all these categories that actually define an entire program of how to look buildings in terms of form. So they came, this list of words to which John refers as just the components of this strange form or strange being that is a building. Behind the building, you could find around grid, frame, post, beam, panel, center, periphery, field, edge, line, plane, volume, extension, compression, tension, shear. But at the end, the building is just something that condenses all those formal categories. When you start to work on with them, you are able remotely that you are just doing something that has to do with an architectural event that has something to do with the building. John Hejduk says, working with the 9 square grid, the student catches the meaning of plan, elevation, section, details, learns to draw. And says again, the understanding of the elements is revealed and an idea of fabrication emerges. It was a fertile way of entering in this world of formal abstract thoughts that are behind the architecture.
So I'm going to insert here because I want to take a moment where so you were coming when you had already been at Cooper, but then you went back to Spain and you were chair at ETSAB. Actually, you were chair at the school in Barcelona before you spent time at Cooper. And then after Cooper, you returned to Spain and you were chair at ETSAM, at the school in Madrid, the famous school in Madrid. And I'm very intrigued by the fact that your chairs at both of these schools were tied to the topic of composition, and maybe just because that's what they were named. So when you were in Barcelona, your chair from 1970 to 1972 was called Elements of Composition. And your chair at ETSAM between 1980 and 85, so right before you're coming to the GSD, was called Professorship of Architectural Composition, which seems to fit very much within what you're describing as Hejduk's idea of seeing architecture as these elements, the frame, the grid, the beam, as you say, the center. So do you feel like you were already set up to be approaching architecture in this compositional manner, or was that simply a matter of the title of this position in Spain?
No, so surely the compositional manner was over. Still, those disciplines in the Spanish architectural curriculums kept the name of elementos de composición, but obviously, anybody thought in the way though this title has been coined. Difficult to say that in 1970s, when I went to Barcelona, still thinking in building like the result of putting together, of just composing and taking several elements which you knew, and the fact of thinking of forming the building had to do with those compositional devices that at the end ended up just playing with the system of axes in which to establish, let's say, relationships related with equilibrium and balance, or just trying to explain how behind one of those parties was a certain character. That hasn't to do anymore, neither with the way I thought architecture should be taught, neither obviously with the formal approaches of John Hejduk in the 9 square grid. I tried to go just dismantling the idea of composition that, as you know, came from this split that happens in late 18th century and mostly 19th century between architects and engineers. Architects remain with this artistic component of just trying to master how dispose masses and structuring the shape of the building, and then between this idea of composition of the abstract approach of John, I tried to be much more going directly to buildings themselves. I always thought that you learn from the actual reality that buildings are, that just you find out and in the substance of what has been built, the matter that actually consists and defines what the architecture is about. And therefore, I try to offer students specific buildings that allow to me to discover some architectural issues that allow it to me to find out some problems to which they should pay attention. And therefore, that would be this specificity and this attempt to learn from what has already been built instead of just moving where I based my exercises in Barcelona.
No, I think that's super interesting, and that doesn't surprise me that you explain that that's your distinction from both the compositional professorships that you had in Spain, but also the 9 square grid and the approach of the New York 5. You have an interest, I think, in composition and rigor and precision, but married to this idea of materiality and actual building. So that I think it makes sense, and that characterizes for me your approach. But tell me how you brought that to teaching, because materiality, as you know, when we're teaching, we're mostly trafficking in representation of materiality, and ever more so today. And so tell me a little bit more about when you came to the GSD in 1985, how you brought this idea of materiality to the curriculum and to your approach of teaching.
Well, I would like to consider probably materiality under 3 points of view. Okay. The very first one has to do with something that is very often forgotten today, that is that architecture in itself is a kind of reality that asks to be experienced. I think it's difficult to believe that architecture is something that could be represented or that could be written as music is with a score. And I think that it's difficult to think that you are able to understand what buildings are and take contact and establish a strict relationship with what the architecture is throughout simple representation. Instead, I believe that the experience is needed, an experience that has to do with the sensorial experience. In a way, it is difficult to believe that when you enter into the Pantheon in Rome, you are not just being taken by something that is able to affect directly your senses. This sensorial experience is something that can't be ignored. In a way, the pleasure of just building something means to do something that reaches the category of being that is out of this extension of yourself that the building could be considered. Therefore, I believe that it makes sense to pay attention to this sense of, let's say, of buildings as something that deserves us to be experienced. It is in this you're completing the entire and the needed relationship between buildings and people. In a way, it's difficult to think buildings without they're ready to be penetrated, to entering people there to just ending up the completed meaning that a building has. Mm-hmm. The second idea of notion of materiality with buildings has to do with the most often used, let's say, meaning of what, or just meaning of what architecture is, that has to do with construction. In a way, the architecture ended up just being able to provide materials with the form that allow enclosing spaces, and then architecture could be seen almost as inevitably related with construction. I would say that very often architecture resides in this effort to define and to invent the convention that allow construction. You need and adapt, or at least the traditionally construction and materiality and architecture are the notions that are intimately joined, and therefore they're difficult to see in architectural terms without this materiality. And third, I will end up answering a bit to your question about what means actual materiality in buildings nowadays. I would say that we are fooling ourselves when we believe that we have visited buildings or no buildings because we have seen images of them. And I still believe that the real thing of a building is the actual test to learn architecture. Therefore, I very much recommend the students still to travel. I know that travel has lost the meaning that it had, but just the presence of buildings what actually ended up for opening your eyes about what architecture could be. I would encourage people to travel, to see things that they believe they know, and yet they are happily for them still expecting to provide them with such an unforgettable experience.
I was struck, I think in one place you wrote about the fact that you only write about a building if you've experienced it. So I'm not surprised that you give so much attention to the sensorial experience of a building as part of its materiality and success. And I agree with you that it's very important to get students to go see buildings, travel, or even frankly go across the street and walk into a building next door and understand it. But tell me how you taught that. You can encourage students to travel, but how did you teach students to understand the importance of materiality? These three aspects that you put on the table: the sensorial, the importance of construction, and the importance of visiting a building in person. How was that introduced into your curriculum?
Well, surely that today, to be an architect is not anymore to be a master builder, unfortunately, in a way. I would say that what the School of Architecture should look for is actually to provide students, or to provide young architects with the ability to make their minds, allowing them to find out and to explain first to themselves what means to them to give form, and then to provide the instructions that the still society seems to put in the hands of architects, in an architect, about how a building should be. It is much more an issue of providing an education than just providing the body of knowledge. Unfortunately, the body of knowledge is very difficult to be classified and to be put in the hands of the students. Schools are reflecting what society asks to architects to do today. And architects are not asked anymore very often to do what they used to do. And therefore, I would say that the school has more to do with education in the broadest understanding of the word, that just with providing just with those knowledge that will allow students and young architects to offer to society something unexpected. In a way, architects and the students know are going to have a second school in the offices where are going to work on, and at least that they want to keep and to serve to others just in other avenues of how to be and to call themselves architects. I would say that the school should be open today, and surely it is, and surely anybody is asking this sense of canonical curriculum, and just the opposite. The schools are much more today the labs where people and architects and society as a whole shows their ideas and their projects to be tested. That has changed the role of the school, and therefore they're not many important. They are so important that they are close to what scientists used to do, but in this broadest field of human sciences. And obviously school as the GSD, I would say that also should keep let's say the memories of what traditionally has been the study of history, because even from the work that I said, the idea of half of architecture acts for thinking that what you do is added to something that you wanted or not is there, and then you are continuing something that has been given. And that seems to me that understanding how to pursue it and then how to continue what cities and the medium that we have received is the role architects should play in the upcoming future.
That actually segues into a question I had for you about the role of history, because you famously taught a course here called On Contemporary Architecture and Design Theories in Architecture, which led to your book, Theoretical Anxiety and Design Strategies in the Work of 8 Contemporary Architects. Somehow, when it changed from being a course to being a book, anxiety was introduced in there. I'm curious where anxiety came in. Theoretical anxiety, was that part of your course, or was that only in the book? But also how you approach the contemporary and the role of history with the contemporary, which you've started to get to right now with your comments about history.
Well, on the way, I think that I refer to what you are asking me now, Sarah, because what I said, when I emphasized that you should learn architecture, just taking advantage of what has been already built, that it is in the actual body of knowledge of this body of what has been built throughout the years in the world, that you have the matter to learn what the architecture has been and what you think that it could be in the future. That means that it's about history, the way you have today, and then to be introduced in architectural terms. In a way, it can be said that once the treatises went away and anymore the canon has useful in schools since let's say since the 1950s, treatises has been changed by histories. Students have learned architecture in the narrative that has been given of how architecture has evolved. In this moment, and even though we have dozens of histories that allow us to enter and to know something about architects and architectural development, and at the end, I think that the way the most, let's say, popular history has been written has been always written with the very previously established bias or previously established point of view that isn't any more valuable today for just even classifying or making the narrative or just establishing the issues and the problems that architects have today. I think that any of those classical histories, no matter that some of them has been updated, are they able to provide let's say, the actual entry into the problems architects have when they are built, we are building all over the world. And therefore, I think that this attempt to write or to afford the new histories or the histories of contemporary architecture, just answering the problems architects have today, it is something absolutely needed, and it is the most immediate, let's say, most immediate project to be afforded by those studying critically architecture.
So by looking at contemporary practices, you trace history through looking at specific practices and specific contemporary buildings. That's one way of making history, making ties to history today, as opposed to having a canon or having a treatise, right? That's what you're arguing, is that you can read, as a reader of architecture, in reading a building, you need to actually look at its history, its materiality, its experience. But that's how you're saying history is best introduced today, as opposed to a canonical narrative.
Well, when you are putting together today's architecture and materiality, you are right, and I concede that today's architecture is less tired and less committed with the materiality that it used to be.
Right.
Probably it would be because very often even this materiality has changed the scale. In a way, we are unable to take the pleasure we have in a small scale, just enjoying materials texture, let's say the marble in Greece or the brick in Italy. Instead, just is this kind of very, let's say, fragile structure that at the end ought to be upheld by just the role they are playing in this larger new architectural product that are cities. I mean, in a moment, you could say that new cities that are very much following the American downtowns are indeed providing a new view of materials that are giving birth to a larger perception of what architecture does. In a way,
that's super interesting. The idea of saying that contemporary materials don't have that same immediacy. I mean, I think the spectrum of contemporary materials and the scale, as you point out, does pull away some of that sensorial dimension and intimacy that you were talking about, partly the scale of cities and buildings today. I want to open up to one more topic, because I think that this tie of materiality and history and composition, it's all, of course, the challenges that we face in the academy. But as you know, there's one more topic that's looming quite large in the contemporary world, which is right now in the US, we're deeply immersed in a moment, a collective moment of reckoning vis-a-vis the roots, continuations, and repercussions of structural racism. And you wrote in 1965, so a while ago, you wrote in an article, "I cannot understand how an architecture which forgets prevailing social and economic conditions can be called technical. Such an architect therefore escapes by not controlling the reality that surrounds him." So you were tying, at that moment, already in 1965, you were tying the importance of the social to the material and the technical in defining what an architect's responsibilities were. So how would you teach students today not to escape that? How would you engage this particular reality, social reality, today?
But coming back in this sense, that to establish the valuable continuity between what we receive and what we need, let's say, give to the word need, the broader meaning, is the way we have to embed it in our practice, all the problems we have today. I think that when you ask the profession to be engaged with the actual social issues, with the issues that are just taking or affecting the majority, you need to give answer to what to be done with the, let's say, with the cities or the ecology, or you need to more than whatever kind of other, let's say, aesthetical proposal, to be able to engage the practice with this legacy that we have received, that are cities. And I mean, at the end, I would like to advocate for just taking cities as that would allow us to be even to pursue it, what the profession of the discipline has been, as well as giving or trying to give answer to one of the issues more pregnant today, that has to do with how solve the issues of social life and residence. Therefore, I wouldn't, or I try to believe that still recognizing what architecture has been, you are able to provide and to coincide with interests that could be matter to today's sensibility. And therefore, I think that it's true that we are much more less optimistic about thinking that enlightened architects are able to control what the cities and things are going to be. But I would say that I feel myself much more comfortable in the world that we receive, that was founded in reason, that this total where construction isn't anymore based in what is reasonable to be built. To have the most the architecture is losing the links with the issue related with materiality and construction. More you are leaving that to this much more malleable imaginability of what cities and architecture is, and more difficult to explain how to deal with it.
So maybe you can talk about some of your own buildings in terms of how you intersect these social questions that are being put on the table. If I think of, so when you were chair between 85 and 90, it was, correct?
Mm-hmm.
That was actually a period of less social upheaval, let's say, compared to now or earlier. But maybe if you talk about some examples of how you deal with the role of the public in some of your buildings. I'm thinking of the train station, Atocha, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it terribly, in Madrid, or other public spaces and public buildings where the building intersects with the city. and how you engage the idea of the contemporary society in your practice. Some of the social questions.
From my own work, I would say that I like to think in a building like Atocha or the station of the Prado, where public buildings that are playing a very important role in the city are being interpreted as something that actually allowed the city to follow its path and allowed the grow by growing themselves, both the Prado or Atocha, are allowing to the city to stretch on and to grow. I like to see buildings more ingrained in the city and thinking in the city as a broader reality that just the single building being seen as an object. I like to see buildings able to collaborate and to create this broader sense of the scenography where life happens. And under this point of view, still the city is, in my view, very keep the funding stone for just taking some help when thinking about architecture, much more than just singling buildings as isolated, self-standing buildings.
And no, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think I do appreciate that in your work. The transition between the single building and its context is very much part of your agenda. That's very much something that you pay a lot of attention to. And so I'm going to keep returning to questions of pedagogy and curriculum because really that's our topic, but also that is the challenge of how do you teach something like that, this intersection between architecture and society, which I would argue happens at that intersection between building and the city. So again, I'm trying to get a snapshot of what you were doing in those 5 years as chair in terms of how you prioritize certain parts of what a student should learn. And so where was society in that curriculum for you, in that approach for you as chair?
But probably people learn from many channels that you are not controlling anymore. And that would be the very first thing to think about, that just thinking that you are not just, let's say, establishing the way people are going to grow, but probably they have a sense of what the way they learn that don't need to be so coinciding with the curriculum anymore. I would say that the more you emphasize that people need to find out and to reflect about what buildings are. And I still believe that when you are talking about theory, or you are talking, the very first question is the question in yourself, what thing that the building is. And I realize that is almost a philosophical question, but difficult to think that you are able to design whatever without knowing more exactly what kind of being are you giving life by designing something. That means that this, I will emphasize, let's say, those pieces of the curriculum that helps to reflect in the broader terms. I would say that let's say to learn to make the intersection between learning and having pleasure is also very important. I will encourage students to love architecture, and that comes once more this value of history in architectural teaching, because I think that is rather easy to, let's say, to help the students to find out what are enclosing buildings. Behind buildings is so much work, and help people to see that even in this hermetic world of the built world around us is still so many intellectual adventures in a moment that allow people to get the distance, or just establishing this distance among themselves and what they do. It is very important to get rid of the very much personal expression, and instead being able to find out what their contribution to what the larger building that is the world, the built world, they are able to do. And I said on the way also, Sarah, to emphasize those courses related with architectural theory, just for the pleasure of just keeping alive what let's say the highest academic level students used to have been, is very important for a school like Harvard. I mean, in a way, don't go down just thinking that, let's say, academic studies doesn't have value. And I think that it's quite nice to see the connection with you, with Cowell and John Hejduk. In a way, probably with Cowell never suspected that somebody would take advantage of him just for helping the students to think about what the building is. And obviously,
I think that's a really lovely point. First of all, I love the idea of emphasizing that academic study is a pleasure in its own right and important in its own right. But also the example of Hejduk using Witkover as a means of getting students to understand contemporary practice, but also the role of history, I think is a great example there. And also the idea, I mean, I think it's very interesting that you talk about the importance of encouraging students to take pleasure in architecture. I will say that I have an association of your tenure here with a level of rigor and control over drawings and buildings, over production of plans that were very precise. And I remember being on reviews with you where you would be very precise about asking questions about specific lines. And I think acknowledging that a student or an architect has control over certain things in terms of, say, a detail of how a wall meets a floor. But as you acknowledge, we don't have control over the world, and we don't have control over the people who will use the buildings. We can just produce the possibilities for them to have a life within the building.
Well, let's come back for a moment to something that I have talked many times, and is that architects have used drawing and what drawing meant as a means of representation since the Renaissance till this moment, just for thinking about buildings. Today we think about buildings in quite such a different way. I mean, the issue is what you are thinking about when you think in a building. In the building itself, or in the way the building is thought, is produced, or is represented. Because it is true that, that today you are able to think a building should be the result of ensembling something. And more you see building not more than as French compositional architects. So the building as the result of just synthesizing and putting together all the parts. And nowadays, we see the building as this result where very imprecisely that the role of the architect happens just giving some kind of, let's say, a screen in the city that is the latest thing that remained to him. To find out what you are doing when you are drawing, what you do as an architect gives you the actual role you are playing. Probably we are going to live with many worlds at once. That means that you don't need to think architects needs to be taught in a single way.
Sure.
I think that is a general education of being an architect that obviously is one of the nicest things of being in the world, because it opens so much your eyes to see and to understand so many things. In a way, an architect is questioning why things and the things that matters to him or her that are buildings, why they have the form they have taken, and why, which is the. That's, I think that you have made to me also this question, and then to establish the true relationship between who are you representing when designing, because early times it was much more easy to establish the relationship between clients and ideology, therefore ideology and architects. In this moment, it's very painful and very frightening to see that architects has been left as responsible of what the logical attempts or the logical wills of others have been left in our hands. It is a bit too much. The more you are able, at this point of view, of just ingraining and connecting with the actual responsible, the better. But society tries more and more to specialize what people does.
That's interesting. I think you keep your answer here has been swinging me from like extreme optimism to pessimism, all within one answer. So I think that the idea that you as an architect, as you practice, in a sense, you're a lifelong learner, right? I mean, I think that's part of the reason why architects continue to practice well past the retirement of most professions, because you're still learning. I mean, the field is changing. You, as you practice today, you're still learning. You're still a student in a way. The world is changing. And then the pessimistic side of your answer is this idea that this generalist approach that is such the pleasure for us as perpetual students of architecture is countered by society wanting us to be specialists and hyper expertise in certain areas. And I think you're right to resist that and say the generalist approach, the ability for the architect to look across the building and look across society and look across history remains relevant and remains important. We are getting a lot of questions, and I realize it's already 1 o'clock, and so why don't we switch over to some of the questions. What I'll do, there are a lot, and so I won't get to all of them. I'm sorry to everyone in the audience. It's a big audience. And so let me just start with some, and I'll read them to. Rafael is not seeing the questions, so I will be the person translating the questions. So one person writes that when people write history, it's a selective process as to what's included, which is, I think, one of the points that you were making. It seems to me that we might look again at the materiality, forms, cultures, and uses of historical buildings and built communities again. What do you think about this? So that's a little bit of an elaboration on your point you were making about the difference between the histories as canonical narratives and how those could be, how we can approach history differently through examples of uses and examples of buildings. Maybe one way of approaching it is your own course where you looked at buildings. So in the course of contemporary, on contemporary architecture and design theories in architecture, where you looked at examples, when you looked at those examples, were you talking about their materiality, their uses, as well as their form and composition?
Well, as I said, probably buildings are losing in a way probably in the past, architecture has been much more strongly related with materiality when we are thinking in materiality as something that is heavier and that something that it suffers gravity. When this is sense that the gravitational forces doesn't matter, that seems that the building changes. It probably we are in the threshold of something that is going to be quite different. But aren't we able to build without just asking help to form, to allow us to be rational? That is a crucial point. Should we admit and then should allow ourselves to build whatever, or just wrapping more than to build? Is it to build, is going to be, let's say, architecture, whatever is wrapped, whatever volume is wrapped and is just establishing the shape of a downtown? If that is the case, how we should afford to say and to make the reading of this kind of building? A building only to last because now very often buildings that are able to have impact just in the moment they are inaugurated and not anymore. Is that the issue of buildings related with permanence, or we are going to see buildings that are going to be turned down very rapidly, and therefore that buildings shouldn't depend upon this materiality that warranty lasting.
I think the challenge of the responsibility of the architect vis-a-vis construction of what I would call also sort of irresponsible buildings that are built for a short turnaround or short lifespan, that ties into, we have several questions that tie into essentially life after graduation. So I think you did a good job of talking about all of the love or passion or variety of a generalist education within the school. But there are several people who are asking, so what happens after graduation? And one who says, you know, when you graduate, you end up as a working level in an office, you get into a rut, you're not really working on the most interesting things. And it's the most sad question, because he says, or he or she says, most forget why they chose architecture as a career and gradually vanish into mediocrity. And so essentially, many of these questions are saying, how can you ensure this kind of responsibility of the architect, attention to all these things that you're talking about right after graduation? When you're a young architect working in the field, you're not Rafael Moneo who can say no to a commission or who can, who gets great commissions. What advice do you have for the young people as they graduate into architecture to ensure that they continue to love what they're doing?
Well, I think that this is, I don't know, to give whatever kind of opinion more than advice is always complicated and dangerous. But I would dare to say that whoever is finishing their studies should think about what kind of things he or her would like to do. I mean, which kind of architecture, what kind of figure, what kind of life you would like to have. I mean, it's a moment when I wonder whether we are able to master our own life. It's true that it's very difficult to say so, but if you are able somehow even making choices about your own jobs, you could say, I would like to be there more than in this other place. I would like better just to work in an academic atmosphere that just being taken by business or being taken by the hierarchical world of a big office. And yet the profession of architect today more and more tags for this new kind of learning steps that are big offices. And at the end, so many of the architects graduated in the GSD are going to large offices, a lot probably. And then whoever make a commitment with them, they should think about how they are spending their years there. Yeah. They need to think whether they're actually completing their formation and just taking the big office as a new second school of actually they're throwing away the best of their time. Other ways that they should find out other ways of being involved with this, let's say, handling and then modeling, just contributing to establishing the physical world that is at the end what architects would like to do. Just being involved in building this upcoming world.
I would piggyback on that. I would agree with you that, I mean, I think that you're right to perceive that students go into offices. Offices are getting bigger and bigger, and often the jobs to be had are in those big offices. They have small positions in a big office. But I think that it's important to, as you say, to question what your own continued formation is. And I think that the student who graduates actually does have a role in that. In other words, no matter where you land as a student after you've graduated, it's important to continue to expand your understanding of architecture, partly yourself and partly to see what you can do in the office that you're in. So you have to take the initiative to carve out that space. Is part of what I'm hearing you say, and part of what I agree with.
But that probably, Sarah, you entered a very private grounds. At the end, issues like that depends upon everyone who, and therefore the I don't know, pursuing happiness in life. Probably something that all of us would like to do, and yet how much we are responsible for all the choices that are driving our life. It's difficult to say, but being, let's say, being loyal with oneself and trying to do what you like to do. Therefore, in a moment in our conversation, I talk about pleasure. It is very important to make the profession with some pleasure, to try to find the place where what you are doing is also providing the sense that you have fun in making what you do, that work isn't the hard lead, no? It's peso, lead. It's a lead that you are born wearing it. Instead, that to work gives you, let's say, the pleasure to be alive one more day.
So that ties in somewhat to a question that someone asked that I thought was quite nice, is asking, as a teacher, to what extent do you balance giving your own point of view to a student, and to what extent do you draw out the student's own persona? Because part of what you're saying is as someone graduates and they develop their own persona, ideally they do have some control, and I acknowledge, as you do, that they don't have a lot of control necessarily, but ideally they take initiative and maintain some control over their own happiness, as you say. But as a teacher, so while you're teaching students, to what extent do you balance that? How do you play with that balance? And I think that's a question that all faculty consider. I think it's a good question to ask.
Well, I wouldn't like, as a teacher, and I wouldn't experience that I am making proselytism. I would like to tell the people the things I think about, but without this attempt to just following just undiscriminately what I said. I think that I have been always frightened by the fact that somebody has just followed what that I thought without any much more personal consideration. I think that I tried. The other thing that I think is important as a teacher is to raise the level of exigence to the students. I think that to try to extract the best of the students is always something that asks for exigence, and exigence not always is so kind,
Yes.
even more with that means evaluations and so on. But to help people to act or be better is very important. I think that I keep big respect for those who stimulate me to do best what I did. Yeah.
Exactly, and I think that that's actually why we all teach. Again, it's a form of continuing to learn. We continue to be stimulated by the questions and the opinions and the directions of our students. There are a couple questions that relate to the contemporary issue of the pandemic, and to what extent do you think that COVID or the pandemic is affecting practice or affecting the city? Those are two different questions.
Well, I think that first has created a sense of a natural landscape. In a way, all of us have asked, just walking in the cities, that was the city I was living on. The city was quite different. What it looks like once people has disappeared.
Yeah.
In a way, these phantom-like images are something that tells about how cities are the tools that needs to be occupied and used intensively by people.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that cities are nicer without people. I see that cities are at its best when they fill up with people, and when you doesn't ask yourself what all these artifacts are. Then, on the other point of view, probably the reflection that the phenomenon is a global phenomenon that has to do with the species of Homo sapiens that at the end it goes above countries and about continents, and we are going to be safe only in a global way that doesn't allow any country to believe that it has been punished by some fate or by some reason, and that we need that we are not anymore the only single species in the world, that actually it seems that the humans that we are the owners, and that we are the only occupants of Earth, and probably many other beings would like to do so, and therefore it has changed a bit our perception of in a more and therefore we need to be safe and only globally, and that is nice to feel that the turn of globalization is good and as well as is needed for just solving these serious issues we have. in terms of more, let's say, physical environment, probably it has helped to recognize how much these houses we live on are two extensions of ourselves, that we should look at where we live with much more sympathy, that at the end, the spaces we live on are and could be seen almost just as a second skin of ourselves, and that we need to do that as better as possible, that probably space and surfaces matters, that way of just providing better conditions of life, and but altogether, let's say that it came in such an unexpected way and so painful way and so problematic way that I don't know, that gives this it seems that we have lived without one of those catastrophes, no? One of those natural catastrophes that people in the past went on, and yet we will not leave this world without thinking that we have known what the tragedy means. Very, very, very hard, bad days.
I think that combination of drawing our attention to our responsibility for living in the world with other creatures, that we no longer can live as if we have total control over the environment and the world that we live in, I think is very humbling. I also think that your call to pay more attention to the spaces, as I understand it, the spaces of domesticity, so that as we all find ourselves today spending far more time in our homes than we ever expected to, I think you're right that attention to what kind of homes we give to people, we design for people, makes a difference. So I think that that's a very poignant and strong way of responding. And yet I also perceive some optimism that the city will return someday to having people in it for you, that you don't see the city as gone forever in terms of the relationship of people living in the city. I want to end with maybe combining two questions. Let's say one that talks about the difficulty of being an architect and one that talks about your passion of being an architect. So partly, and you've suggested this, that architecture is hard. And so, so much, this I'm quoting one of our questioners, so much of success is about enduring the pain and suffering. Particularly in architecture, to realize a building is perhaps 2% fun and 98% pragmatics. This questioner has, that's a pretty limit, that's a pretty tight margin. And so how do you negotiate that side, the sort of challenges or suffering of the architect, with what is it that maintains your passion? What are you most passionate about that maintains your passion in architecture? So it's a fairly personal question to end with, Rafael.
Well, in a way, in spite that I am thinking that very often buildings share with other buildings have been, I would say that in every new project, it is for me something new and something that I thought to approach in a different way. I don't see so easily, let's say, coming back into something that I knew. Whatever thing you go till the very end, you find out that the actual solution, what you see that not to be done, is something that you didn't expect.
Mhm.
And I think that the other thing that I like a lot is to grow the design on time, and then to see that you start with something that hasn't such a clear figure, and yet throughout the elaboration, it was becoming better, and then you are able to, whenever you're still seeing that something could be better, there's still this time to try to do it. And then once that you achieve and that you become relaxed, what you had found, that is a fountain of pleasure and satisfaction. And therefore, I still like to do and to work as an architect. And yet, the office of an architect is being more and more difficult everywhere. Even in a country as Spain, that in the, let's say, in the late 80s and 90s, just the 20 years before the new century, was, let's say, a good place to be an architect. Nowadays, bureaucracy and then the market and the pressure of all the business presence in the business, that's so difficult to be an architect more and more.
So I appreciate that combination, but I want you to end on a positive note. So you have to keep talking a little bit.
No.
You have to give me something positive. You can't end with the fact that it's so difficult.
Bueno. I hope to be able to hold this conversation promptly. That would be a great signal. And thank you also to have chosen as the background for your face, just an image like that. I indeed recognize, and it's beautifully framed, your face in those two verticals, still with those Corbusian resonances.
It's true. It's striking. The relationship of this building with the Carpenter Center, I think, is such a beautiful dialogue on the campus. And it really is I think it's a wonderful space. And so I want to thank you for your time. It makes me very happy to have time to talk with you again. It makes me a little sad not to have you and also not to have you still at the school. But again, I want to thank you for giving us the time and your attention. To the audience, we had far more questions than we could address, but I appreciate everyone's engagement, and thank you for the terrific questions for Rafael, and here's to a good season. So thank you very much, Rafael.
Thank you, Sarah. Very, very sincere thankfulness for that. Thank you.